At the turn of the century, the Ozark Mountains presented a unique blend of beauty and menace. The hills were thick with oak and hickory, the valleys heavy with mist that clung to the hollows even after the sun had climbed high. People who visited often spoke of how quiet it was, how the silence carried its own weight, and how the land itself seemed to hold secrets. Hidden among the ridges was the small town of Mill Creek, a place most travelers would have passed without much notice if not for the Holloway Hotel, a tall wooden structure that rose like a sentinel above the narrow main street. To the locals, it was a place of pride, warm beds, good meals, and a sign that their town was not too far behind the modern world that was spreading quickly across America. But to those who would later hear its name whispered, it became something else entirely, a place where the ground itself seemed to hold a terrible memory. The Holloway Hotel was built in 1897 by the Holloway brothers, men who had made a small fortune from timber and saw opportunity in the steady trickle of traders, drifters, and salesmen passing through the Ozarks. It was not grand by city standards, but in Mill Creek, it was towering, with polished wood floors, tall glass windows, and a chandelier that caught candlelight and later the electric bulbs when power lines finally reached the town. Travelers who stayed there often remembered the place fondly. Its wraparound porch, the sound of fiddle music on weekends, the smell of roasting meat drifting out from the kitchen. For the townsfolk, it was the social heart of their world, a place where news was shared, deals were made, and secrets sometimes slipped into the wrong ears at a first glance. Life in Mill Creek moved at a gentle pace. Farmers worked their fields from dawn until dusk. Women traded gossip at the general store, and children played along the muddy band. Kiss of the creek that gave the town its name. Yet beneath the calm lay currents of unease. The Holloway brothers were admired, but they were also feared. They carried themselves with the air of men who had risen above the rest. And with that rise came a hunger for control. They owned the land, the mill, and soon much of the town owed them in one way or another. Their hotel became more than a business. It was a stage where they showed their power, a place where men drank whiskey that was watered down yet still overpriced, and where women were sometimes spoken of as if they were another item to be bargained over. It was inside this hotel, behind its polished veneer, that cracks began to show. Guests came and went, but not all left with only good memories. Stories drifted through the town in hushed tones. A salesman who vanished after his ledger went missing. A girl who worked in the kitchen and never returned home. A traveler who had been seen late at night near the cellar doors but never checked out. None of these whispers was spoken aloud in daylight, not when the Holloways were near. People knew better than to challenge them directly. They had money, they had friends in the county seat, and most of all, they had the respect, or fear, of nearly every man in Mill Creek. Those who worked in the hotel saw more than they dared to say. A maid who scrubbed the floors noticed strange stains that didn't match spilled wine. A boy who ran errands was once told to fetch water from the old well behind the hotel, but when he peered into its dark mouth, he swore he heard something move inside, as if the earth itself was alive. He told no one, at least not until years later, when people were willing to listen. Among the hotel's regular guests were men of means, landowners, traveling salesmen, even a circuit judge on occasion. They were drawn not only by the comfort of the place, but by the company it promised. The Holloways knew how to make a man feel important, how to flatter and charm until he forgot his better judgment. Women, too, found themselves entangled, some willingly, others less so. There was always a sense that behind the laughter and the clinking of glasses, something darker stirred, a hunger for more than business or pleasure. The people of Mill Creek carried on with their lives, but the hotel cast a long shadow. The laughter that spilled from its doors on Saturday nights sometimes carried an edge that unsettled even those who joined in. The Holloways smiled, shook hands, and said their glasses, yet in their eyes was something that unsettled those who dared to look too long. It was not simply pride. It was the cold gleam of men who had learned how easy it was to bend others to their will. Still, for most, life seemed ordinary enough. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse. Farmers sold their crops to the market. The blacksmith hammered away in his shop, sparks flying into the dust. But those who lived closest to the hotel knew the truth. The nights were different there. The music never seemed to end. The lights burned later than anywhere else, and now and then, when the wind shifted just right, the smell that rose from behind the hotel was not of food or smoke. It was something else, something that clung in the throat. What no one knew, not yet, was that the Holloway Hotel was built on more than ambition. Beneath its foundation lay something older, something the land had held long before the first boards were nailed into place. The well that stood in its shadow had been there for generations, dug deep into the limestone, its mouth rimmed with moss and stone. Some said it was cursed, that nothing good ever came from water drawn from it. The Holloways had laughed at such talk, but they did not fill it in. Instead, they built their empire beside it, as if daring fate to intervene. In time, fate would, and when it did, the name Holloway would no longer bring to mind fine rooms and candlelit dinners. It would become something else, something whispered only in fear and never spoken of in school books or sermons. What happened in that hotel and what was hidden in the depths of that old well would leave scars not only on the town, but on all who dared to remember. The Holloway Hotel in those years looked the same from the outside, lamplight glowing through its tall windows, fiddle music spilling onto the street. But inside, something was shifting. What had begun as a small unease was growing into something harder to ignore. People noticed the laughter around the card tables had turned sharper, the drinking heavier, the tempers quicker to flare. What had once been a place of pride for Mill Creek was becoming a stage where envy, greed, and darker appetites played out in ways no one dared speak of. Openly point, one of the first cracks came when a young farmhand named Caleb started working in the stables behind the hotel. Caleb was quick, hard-working, and had an easy smile that drew attention, especially from one of the Holloway brothers' favored guests, a woman who stayed often at the hotel, always in fine dresses and always alone. Rumors spread fast in a town as small as Mill Creek. People whispered she was a widow with land further north, wealthy enough to travel as she pleased. Caleb, unused to such attention, let himself be charmed. Their stolen glances turned into stolen meetings, and before long, even the brothers noticed. One of them warned Caleb plainly, "She's not yours to look at." Caleb laughed it off at first, thinking it nothing more than pride talking. But from that night on, he found himself watched. The Holloways had never liked losing control, and to them, the farmhand's boldness was more than an insult. It was a challenge. The woman, too, was TR. Eated differently after the whispers grew louder. What had been a harmless game of attention turned into something dangerous, as jealousy tangled with the brother's pride. Caleb began to feel it in ways small but sharp. His wages cut without reason, cold shoulders from men he'd worked beside all his life, the sudden disappearance of a colt he'd been training. He told a friend he thought someone wanted him out, but he never named who. Maybe he didn't dare. While Caleb's story was playing out in the shadows, the hotel itself faced pressures that made tempers shorter. The Holloway's timber business was slowing as cheaper lumber came in by train from farther north. Their debts grew heavier, though they never showed it in public. They still carried themselves as untouchable, but behind closed doors, their arguments turned bitter. Staff spoke of doors slamming late into the night, of one brother shouting about money while the other drank himself into silence. The pressure of keeping their empire standing made them more ruthless. Every deal became a test of dominance, every slight a reason for vengeance. The townsfolk, too, were caught in this tightening web. Many owed the Holloways money, and the hotel became a place where debts were collected in more than coin. A farmer late on payment might be asked to offer a daughter for work in the kitchen. A widow unable to meet her rent might be given a room in the hotel, but at a cost she did not speak of. The sense of unease grew heavy, though few dared act against it. The brothers had friends in the county seat, men who turned a blind eye to complaints so long as the Holloways' money kept flowing. The well behind the hotel remained dark and forgotten by most, though stories clung to it like moss on stone. Some of the younger maids swore they heard splashing late at night, when no one should have been near it. A boy carrying firewood, once claimed he saw a man standing beside it long after the lamps had gone out, staring down into its depths. When he blinked, the man was gone. These stories, dismissed as childish tales, spread quietly, feeding the notion that the land itself was stirring with something foul. Subplots began weaving themselves tighter into the fabric of the hotel. There was Ruth, a maid whose father had gambled away their farm at one of the Holloway's tables. She worked long hours for little pay, her resentment hidden behind quiet obedience. Yet she watched everything. She noticed the woman in fine dresses slipping into locked rooms, noticed Caleb's bruised knuckles after a fight that no one admitted had happened. She also noticed the way one of the brothers lingered too long at the kitchen door, his eyes on the young girls who carried trays into the dining hall. Then there was the preacher, a stern man who arrived in Mill Creek one winter and began holding services in the schoolhouse. He spoke often of sin, of darkness that grew when men let greed and pride rule them. The Holloways hated him instantly. He was a local, and worse, he was not afraid of them. When he began warning parents to keep their daughters away from the hotel, he became an enemy. Soon, his sermons were interrupted by loud laughter from the hotel's porch, drunken men mocking him from across the street. Some nights, stones were thrown through the schoolhouse windows. The preacher stood his ground, but even he admitted to close friends that the town itself felt cursed, as if something rotten had taken root and spread. Inside the Holloway Hotel, confrontations became more frequent. One night, during a card game, a traveling salesman accused one of the brothers of cheating. His voice carried across the hall, silencing the fiddle music and drawing stares. For a moment, it seemed the man might win. The dealer hesitated, others muttered in agreement. But then the Holloway brother rose slowly, his face calm, but his eyes like cold steel. The salesman left the hotel that night with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was never seen in Mill Creek again. The men who had muttered went silent. None ever spoke of it afterward. For Caleb, the tension became unbearable. He tried to end his meetings with the widow, fearing the brother's wrath, but she only laughed, calling him foolish for being afraid. She didn't understand the way power worked in a town like Mill Creek. Or perhaps she did, and simply enjoyed watching the fire she had started. Caleb began drinking more, his once bright spirit dimming into bitterness. He fought with his friends, snapped at his mother, and carried a weariness that made him look years older. People began whispering that the Holloways were breaking him, though no one dared say how. The Holloway brothers themselves were changing. What had once been ambition hardened into cruelty. Their smiles no longer held warmth, only calculation. They drank more, gambled harder, and spoke less to each other. One was haunted by debts, the other by desire. Their empire, built on wood and charm, was cracking under the weight of greed and fear. Yet instead of crumbling, they pressed harder on those around them, squeezing what they could from anyone too weak to fight back. The hotel's air grew thick with tension. Guests came in weary from travel, but they often left more unsettled than when they arrived. The walls seemed to hold whispers, the floors groaned like they carried more weight than they should. The well outside, covered in ivy, became a place no one lingered near. And all the while, the sense of something inevitable built like a storm on the horizon. The breaking point was coming. No one could say exactly when, but everyone felt it. Caleb, the widow, Ruth, the preacher, the Holloway brothers. All their paths were tangled now, pulled tighter each day by pride, jealousy, and secrets no one dared speak aloud. The hotel that once stood as a sign of progress was becoming something else, a place where the air itself felt charged, waiting for a spark. And when that spark came, it would not be quiet. It would tear through Mill Creek like fire through dry grass, leaving behind a story so dark that history itself would try to bury it. The night it happened, Mill Creek lay under a heavy sky. A storm had been threatening all day, the air thick with the smell of rain and the restless hush that made animals stir and children cling to their mothers. The Holloway Hotel glowed against the darkness, its windows bright, its porch alive with drunken laughter and the scrape of boots. Inside, music played too loudly, trying to drown out the undercurrent of unease that had been building for weeks. But no fiddle, no whiskey, no hollow laughter could stop what was already in motion. Caleb had been drinking since sundown. His hands shook as he poured each glass, not from cold, but from the rage and weariness that had been gnawing at him. The widow had told him that afternoon she was leaving soon, heading back north. She had smiled when she said it, almost cruel in her detachment. "You thought this was more than it was," she told him, brushing past him as if he were nothing more than another farmhand. Those words cut deeper than any blow the Holloways had ever dealt him. He felt humiliated, used, and most of all, cornered. He carried that wound with him into the hotel, where the Holloway brothers watched him with quiet satisfaction, as if they had been waiting for him to stumble. The rain began to fall just as the music shifted into something faster, more fevered. Glasses clinked, men shouted over their cards, and the brothers prowled the room with their usual mix of charm and menace. Caleb sat in the corner, eyes burning holes into the woman across the room. She wore a red dress that night, her hair pinned high, her laughter ringing out as she leaned toward one of the brothers. That sight broke something in him. He pushed back his chair, unsteady but purposeful, and walked across the room. Every step echoed, though no one seemed to hear until his hand caught her arm. "What are you doing here?" His voice cracked, raw with drink and desperation. She pulled away, trying to laugh it off, but the sound faltered under the weight of his grip. The brother beside her rose, his face darkening. For a moment, the room froze. The fiddle stopped, the cards were set down, and every eye turned toward the small storm brewing in their midst. The Holloway brother spoke low, cold. "Let her go, boy." But Caleb was past reason. His pride, his heartbreak, his months of humiliation all burst through at once. He shouted, words no one later could agree on, but they carried the sting of defiance. His hand shoved against the table, sending glasses flying, whiskey soaking into the wood. The widow gasped, stumbling back. The brother moved faster than anyone expected, striking Caleb across the face. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the crowded room. Caleb staggered, then lunged. Chairs crashed to the floor, men shouted, women screamed. The two figures collided, fists flying, rage pouring out of them both. One fought for pride and survival, the other for dominance and control. The widow pressed herself against the wall, her face pale, while the other Holloway brother pushed through the crowd, his hand closing around something glinting in the lamplight. A knife that it happened. In seconds, yet stretched into eternity. Caleb, bloodied but wild, pinned one brother against the table. The other stepped in, the blade flashing once, twice. The first thrust caught Caleb in the side. His breath left him in a choking gasp, eyes wide in disbelief. The second strike drove deeper, and he fell, dragging glasses and cards to the floor with him. The room erupted into chaos. The widow screamed. Some men tried to rush forward but were shoved back. Others turned away, too afraid to intervene. The Holloway brothers stood over Caleb's body, their chests heaving, their faces caught between rage and something colder, fear. Blood spread across the wooden floor, dark and shining under the lamplight. Caleb gasped once more, trying to form words, but nothing came. Then his eyes fixed on nothing, and he was still. The silence that followed was suffocating. The music had long stopped, and even the storm outside seemed to hold its breath. The widow sank to her knees, hands trembling as she pressed them to her mouth. The younger maids wept quietly, clutching each other. Men who had been bold only minutes earlier now stood rooted, not daring to move. The Holloway brothers exchanged a glance, one filled with silent understanding. They could not undo what had been done, but they could bury it, literally. The older brother barked orders, his voice steady in a way that chilled those who heard it. "Get him out. Now." Two men, debtors too afraid to refuse, were forced to drag Caleb's lifeless body toward the back hall. His blood left a trail behind, drops soaking into the cracks of the floorboards. Ruth, the maid, turned her face away but never forgot the sight. They carried him out into the storm, toward the well. The rain fell harder, masking the sound of hurried footsteps and the dull thud of lifeless weight. The well stood waiting, black mouth open, as if it had known all along what it would be asked to swallow. They lifted Caleb's body, his head lolling, his hair plastered to his bloodied face. For a moment, one of the men hesitated, muttering a prayer. But the Holloway's eyes burned into him, and he obeyed. The body dropped, striking stone before vanishing into the dark water below. Back inside the hotel, the brothers cleaned what they could. Whiskey was poured across the bloodstains to dull the smell. Chairs were set upright, and glasses collected. They ordered the music to start again, forcing the fiddle player's trembling hands to lift his bow. The sound was weak, broken, but it filled the silence just enough. Guests were told to drink, to forget, to remember that nothing had happened. But something had. Everyone knew it. The widow sat trembling, refusing to speak. Ruth's eyes were sharp, recording every detail. The preacher, who had not been inside that night, but heard the screams from across the street, would soon come knocking. And the Holloway brothers, though calm in their commands, carried the weight of what they had done in the tightness of their jaws, in the flicker of doubt behind their eyes. The crime had unfolded like a storm, sudden and violent, yet inevitable. Pride, jealousy, and control had met in one room, and a young man's life had been spilled out onto the hotel floor. The well had taken him, swallowed him whole, but the town would not forget. The air itself seemed to hold the memory, heavy and unshakable. And though the Holloways thought they had buried their sin in the dark, it was only the beginning. The aftermath would spread through Mill Creek like fire, burning away any illusion of safety the town had once held. The days after Caleb's death stretched long and heavy, as if time itself had slowed under the weight of what had happened. The Holloway Hotel carried on as though nothing had taken place, its doors still swinging open for travelers, its porch still crowded with laughter and music on Saturday nights. Yet beneath the surface, nothing was the same. The townsfolk who had been there that night walked with lowered eyes, their silence louder than any words. Everyone knew, but no one dared to speak. The Holloway brothers set the tone, their calm rehearsed and chilling. When asked about Caleb's sudden absence, they brushed it off. The boy left town, one said. He was restless, couldn't keep a job. Their voices were smooth, their smiles quick, but their eyes gave them away. There was a hardness there, an edge sharper than before. They had always been men of power, but now they carried the aura of men who had crossed a line and found themselves stronger for it, or at least determined to appear so. Some believed them, or pretended to. A few men at the mill muttered that Caleb had always been reckless, that it was no surprise he'd run off after causing trouble. Others repeated the Holloway's words in the tavern, letting them settle into the air as if repetition could turn lies into truth. But some knew better. Those who had seen the blood on the floor, heard the scream that cut through the storm, or watched the body being dragged into the rain. For them, silence was not a choice but a necessity. The Holloways had ears everywhere, and no one wanted to be next. The widow left town quietly, slipping away with only a small trunk and her red dress folded at the bottom. She said nothing, not even to the women who had once whispered about her in the store. Her eyes carried a hollow look, one that told of things seen and felt that she could never put into words. Some said she fled north. Others swore she was escorted out by one of the Holloway men in the dead of night. Wherever she went, her absence left a void that was filled only with suspicion. Ruth, the maid, carried the weight more heavily than most. Every night, she scrubbed the same patch of floor where Caleb's blood had spilled, her rag darkening though the stain had long been hidden under whiskey. She could still see it, no matter how clean it looked. She dreamed of the well, of its black mouth swallowing more than just a body. Sometimes she woke gasping, the echo of Caleb's last breath ringing in her ears. She began writing small notes of what she had seen, tucking them under a loose board beneath her bed. It was her only way to fight the suffocating silence. Though she knew if those notes were ever found, she would be lost. The preacher, too, carried the burden. He had not been inside that night, but he heard the whispers afterward. People came to him in secret, confessing in half-finished sentences there, guilt spilling out in trembling voices. He urged them to speak louder, to name what had been done, but fear sealed their mouths. In his sermons, he thundered against hidden sins and dark wells, but the Holloways laughed from their porch, mocking him with raised glasses. His words fell heavy but powerless, bouncing off the walls of a town too afraid to rise. The Holloway brothers felt the strain in their own ways. One drowned himself in drink, sitting alone in the darkened parlor after guests had gone, staring into the bottom of his glass as if Caleb's face might appear there. The other grew sharper, his temper shorter, his need for control absolute. He barked at staff, threatened debtors, and prowled the halls of the hotel late into the night. He told himself they had done what was necessary, that Caleb had left them no choice. Yet the memory clung. Caleb's gasp, the blood spreading wide, the heavy thud of his body vanishing into the well. They did not speak of it to each other, but it lived between them, poisoning even their victories. For the town, the Holloway Hotel became something darker than before. People still came, still drank and gambled, but the joy was gone. Laughter was forced, smiles thin. Parents warned their children to stay away after dark. Travelers spoke of the uneasy feeling in the halls, as though the walls held secrets too heavy to bear. The reputation of the brothers, once mixed with admiration, turned colder. They were still powerful, still untouchable, but their names were whispered now, not praised. Fear had replaced respect. The legal system never came. The sheriff, an old friend of the Holloways, asked no questions. When Caleb's mother went to him, begging for answers, he told her to let it go. Boys wander, he said, though his eyes avoided hers. She returned to her small farm alone, her grief silent but unyielding. At night, she lit a candle in her window, hoping her son might still walk through the door. Deep down, she knew the truth, though she could never prove it. That knowledge hollowed her out, left her staring at empty fields that once had been filled with her son's laughter. The well behind the hotel grew heavier in legend. Children dared each other to approach it, though few did. Those who did swore they heard whispers, as if the stone walls themselves remembered. Some claimed on stormy nights the sound of splashing rose from its depths, though no one dared lean too far to listen. The well became a place to be avoided, even by those who pretended not to believe. It stood as a quiet monument to what the town refused to speak of in the months that followed. Mill Creek was not the same. Trust thinned, and neighbors looked at each other with wary eyes. The Holloways still hosted gatherings, but the crowds grew smaller. The preacher continued his sermons, though his voice grew tired. Ruth's notes multiplied, filling the space beneath her bed, a secret record of a TR. She feared might otherwise vanish. Caleb's mother kept her candle burning, and the Holloways, though still kings of their empire, began to look over their shoulders more often, as if they knew that no amount of power could keep the past buried forever. The crime had not ended with Caleb's death. It lingered in every silence, every averted glance, every whispered rumor. Mill Creek became a town built on denial, its heart darkened by fear. The Holloway Hotel still stood tall, but its shadow stretched long across the valley, reminding everyone that nothing stayed hidden forever, not even in the deepest well. Years passed, yet the night Caleb died never left Mill Creek. The Holloway Hotel still stood, its wooden frame weathered by storms but unbroken, its porch still lined with men who pretended to laugh too loud, drink too deep, and forget too much. But the soul of the place had changed forever. What had once been pride was now a burden, a weight carried by every person who had seen or heard what happened that storm-soaked night. The silence of the town became its own kind of curse. The Holloway brothers lived on, but not untouched. They had buried Caleb in the well, yet they could not bury the unease that clung to them. The younger brother's drinking grew worse, his nights filled with muttered words and restless pacing. Some swore they heard him arguing with no one, his voice echoing in empty hallways, as if he still fought with the ghost of the boy he had stabbed. The elder brother, colder and more controlled, grew harder with time. He made enemies easily, his threats sharper, his temper shorter. He held on to power with an iron grip, but even he could not escape the look in people's eyes when they turned from him. It was not respected anymore. It was fear, laced with quiet loathing. Ruth carried her notes for years, hidden beneath her bed, pages that recorded every detail she remembered from that night. She married, raised children, and kept her silence, but she never let the record vanish. When she was older, she showed them to her eldest daughter, telling her, "This is the truth no one would speak. Keep it safe." That act became her justice, not in courts or headlines, but in the quiet hope that one day someone would know Caleb had not simply wandered off. The preacher stayed in Mill Creek longer than anyone expected. His sermons softened with age, but he never stopped warning against hidden sins and false power. He grew to be a weary man, often doubting if his words ever made a difference. Yet those who heard him in his last years remembered that his voice trembled most not when he spoke of heaven or hell, but when he spoke of men who let pride blind them to mercy. Some said his words were about the Holloways. Though he never named them, Caleb's mother lived the rest of her days with the candle burning in her window. She died still waiting, though by then everyone knew she was not waiting for her son's return, but for justice that never came. Her grief became legend, a quiet symbol of the weight carried by women who had lost sons to violence and silence alike. The town itself bore scars. The Holloway Hotel remained open, but it was no longer the heart of Mill Creek. Families began gathering elsewhere. Children were kept at home after dark, and travelers often remarked on the uneasy air of the place. The well, overgrown and crumbling, was avoided at all costs. Some said you could still hear water stirring deep within, but few were brave enough to test it. The land itself seemed marked by what it had swallowed. Justice, at least in the formal sense, never came. The sheriff grew old and retired without ever speaking of Caleb. The Holloways faced no trial, no cell, no verdict. To outsiders, the story never even existed. But to those who had lived it, justice was something more complicated. Some found it in survival, in keeping families safe by staying silent. Others found it in whispers, in passing the story quietly so it would not be lost. And some found it only in their nightmares, where the truth returned again and again. Looking back, the Holloway Hotel became less about one crime and more about everything it revealed. It showed how power could twist a town, how fear could silence even the righteous, how pride could drive men to kill and others to stand by and watch. It laid bare the truth that justice was not always written in law books or handed down by judges. Sometimes it lived only in memory, in the way a community carried the weight of what it chose not to confront. The story of Caleb's death and of the Holloway brothers who tried to bury it is not just about a single night. It is about the fragile line between power and morality, about how wealth and fear can bend truth until it breaks. It reminds us that silence itself can be a crime, and that the deepest wells are not dug in the ground, but in the hearts of those who refuse to speak. In the end, Mill Creek became a place where people learned to live with shadows. The hotel still stood, but no one spoke of it with pride anymore. The Holloway name, once carved into signs and deeds, faded into whispers. And the well, always the well, stood as the one silent witness that could never be silenced. Some say history is written by the victors. In Mill Creek, history was erased by the powerful. But even erased histories leave traces. In the hushed voices of mothers, in the sermons of weary preachers, in the scribbled notes of a maid who refused to forget, the truth remained. Not in books or courts, but in memory. And so, the Holloway Hotel became more than just a building. It became a lesson carved into the bones of a town. That power can cover sins, but never erase them. That justice denied still haunts. And that every well, no matter how deep, cannot hide the weight of what it holds forever.